Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs, but luckily there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
Time is precious, and so are our pets. So time with our pets is extra precious. That's why we started Dutch. Dutch provides 24/7 access to licensed vets with unlimited virtual visits and follow-ups for up to 5 pets. You can message a vet at any time and schedule a video visit the same day. Our vets can even prescribe medication for many ailments, and shipping is always free. With Dutch, you'll get more time with your pets and year-round peace of mind when it comes to their vet care. Go to Dutch.com to get vet care that is always there for just $92 a year.
This episode of Ben Franklin's World is brought to you by Cornell University Press. Manifest Destiny, the 19th century idea that the United States would stretch from sea to shining sea, wasn't just a territorial concept. In his award-winning book, With Sails Whitening Every Sea, Mariners and the Making of an American Maritime Empire, Brian Rouleau demonstrates that the idea of manifest destiny applied to the seas as well. Rouleau argues that during the early Republic, American sailors served as the principal agents of the United States' overseas foreign relations, and that their everyday encounters, which included those problematic interactions and barroom brawls, port city bordellos, and performances of blackface minstrel shows, shaped how foreigners perceived the United States. Reviewers have noted that With Sails Whitening Every Sea forces us to reconsider the ways in which foreign relations work, because, as it turns out, ordinary people have had an enormous impact on international affairs. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/Cornell for more information about Brian Rouleau's With Sails Whitening Every Sea. And remember, when you visit the website, to look for and use the promo code 09BFW because it'll save you 30% off titles published by Cornell University Press.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 120 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. How do you build colonies without women? Most of the first colonial adventurers who set out for Jamestown, New France, and colonial Louisiana were men. They left England and France to seek their fortunes in North America, and in return, the governments of England and France hoped that they would settle and establish English and French settlements in North America. But again, how do you build a colony without women? How do you get the men to stay in North America without companionship and without helpmeets to do the domestic work of housekeeping, cooking, and laundry that the men had grown accustomed to back in Europe? Today, University of South Carolina law professor Marcia Zug takes us through one of the solutions that both England and France used to build their North American colonies: mail-order bride programs. During our conversation, Marcia reveals information about colonial Jamestown, New France, and Louisiana and their mail-order marriage programs, details about why women were interested in participating in mail-order marriage programs, and the role mail-order marriage programs played in American westward expansion during the 19th century. But first, did you know that episodes now feature a complimentary episode list? With over 125 episodes, Ben Franklin's World now has enough of a back catalog for me to suggest past episodes that pair well with current episodes. For example, this episode features information about Jamestown and New France. This makes episode 79 with Jim Horn, who also discusses details about colonial Jamestown, a great compliment. As is episode 108 with Ann Little, who discusses the life of Esther Wheelwright, a New English girl who's taken captive by Native Americans, who finds her way to New France, where she becomes Mother Superior of the Ursuline Convent in Quebec. So if you're ever looking for more information or context about the topics we're discussing, be sure to check out the show description for the episode you're listening to in your favorite podcast app or on the show notes page for that episode, because that's where you'll find a list of episodes that will complement what you're listening to. Ready to learn more about early American mail-order marriage programs? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us is a professor of law at the University of South Carolina Law School. She specializes in family and American Indian law, and her latest research, which focuses on the intersection of family and immigration law, produced a book, Buying a Bride, An Engaging History of Mail-Order Matches. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Marcia Zug.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Marcia, before we dive deep into the history of mail-order brides, would you tell us how you became interested in the topic?
I don't have a specific moment, but my research areas are family law and immigration law. And it just sort of had always been in the periphery of my mind. And whenever I'd brought it up as an idea to work on, people would get so excited. A lot of times when you're a law professor and you tell people what you're working on, their eyes glaze over and they get a little bored. But I'd say mail-order brides, like, ooh, tell me about that. So I thought it was the sort of thing that could turn into a good book.
You know, this is something I can totally relate to. It seems like law professors and historians have similar party-going experiences. I mean, I know when I go to a party and I tell people I'm a historian, they either get really excited and they talk to me about history for a half an hour, or their eyes glaze over and they can't wait to get out of conversation with me. But back to the topic of mail-order brides. How far back in history does the custom of mail-order brides go?
That's a good question. It's hard to say specifically. What tends to lead to mail-order marriage is when you have a big gender disparity in the population. So when there are a lot more men than women, and specifically when there are a lot more men than women that they consider marriageable, right? So there might be other women, but there aren't women that they consider ones that they can marry. And then what happens is there'll be concerted efforts to actually recruit women to come over and marry these men. And this tends to happen in colonization situations. So it's certainly, mail-order brides have been with us since the beginning of the North American colonization, but they probably existed in many colonization efforts that occurred earlier. One of the ones that comes to mind is Ireland. So when the English were colonizing Ireland, obviously there were a lot of Irish women there that they could have married, but they saw problems with the Irish women as marriageable, so they may have tried to bring over English women as brides for the colonists.
You just noted that a community may deem a woman as unmarriageable. What traits exactly did male colonists look at when they tried to decide whether a woman was marriageable?
Well, it depends, obviously, on the society that you're in. In America, a lot of it has had to do with race. If the women were, the right background, the right race, the women who tended to be considered unmarriageable in the United States were the American Indian women. So there were plenty of them, and I'm going to talk a lot about gender disparities in the colonies, but when I say that, I really mean the gender disparities in terms of white men and white women. There were plenty of American Indian women who were around during this period, and marriage to them was actually considered a problem. And that's part of the reason why you get mail-order brides, is to stop these men from entering into relationships with Indian women.
You've hinted about the fact that mail-order marriages have had a long history in North America. In fact, in your book, Buying a Bride, you've dated the beginning of mail-order marriages to the settlement of Jamestown, Virginia. So, would you tell us about colonial Jamestown and how and why the settlement there developed a mail-order marriage program?
Well, there are two different types of colonies at the beginning. You've got your northern colonies and your southern colonies. And the northern colonies are not having a recruitment problem. These are the Puritans, people who are coming to escape religious persecution. They bring their families. Things are so bad back in Europe that they're going to stay. No matter how bad they might be in Massachusetts, they're in for the long haul. So you don't have a problem getting women there. But in the southern colonies, it's very different. You don't have the same sort of religious motivation factors. You have people coming to the southern colonies for economic reasons. And what happens is they come over to the southern colonies. They want to make their money, but things are also pretty terrible. At the very beginning, there's a lot of starving, a lot of disease. So the men who come over aren't that committed to staying. And then when they don't have women to marry, they don't really put down roots. So you get the system where the men are coming over, they're going to spend a few years here, they're going to get their money, and then they're going back to England to get married. And that's fine for them, but that's really a bad situation if you want to set up a permanent settlement, to have this rotating band of colonists, none of whom are around very long, not really invested in the future of the colony. So you have this problem where you have the southern colonies have a hard time recruiting permanent settlers in general, and they have a particularly hard time recruiting women because rumors about how bad things are in Virginia get back to England really quickly. The first set of colonists, die real fast. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And a lot of the women back in England are like, no, this just doesn't seem like a good plan. We're not going. So the women are not coming over. Men are still coming over to seek their fortune, but they're doing one of two things. Like I mentioned, they're staying for a few years and going back to get married and, live their rich lives back in England, or they start taking up with native women in local tribes. These are men who are like, oh, this colony stinks. It's horrible. That native village over there, they seem to be doing okay. And there are women. I'm leaving. I want nothing to do with this. And, the early Jamestown tries a lot of things. Desertion is a hanging offense, but that doesn't stop the men from leaving. So they're deserting in droves. And this also has political implications, because if you're trying to justify colonization based on the superiority of your culture, your religion, all of these things, yet your colonists who are supposed to be bringing this superior stuff have decided that the culture you're intending to conquer actually looks a lot more appealing, you have a problem with the moral basis for colonization. So for all of these reasons, Jamestown decides something really needs to be done, and quickly.
We've spoken with other historians, and they've told us that back in England, there were men who promoted the colonies by writing such wonderful things about North America, like how many fish swam in its lakes and rivers, and how there was an abundance of wildlife that lived in vast expanses of forests with different trees that could easily be cleared to create great farmsteads. But I have to tell you, Marcia, you've talked a lot about starving and disease. I mean, you're not exactly selling us on colonial Jamestown. So how did colonial promoters or Jamestown colonists sell women on the idea that they should migrate to Virginia?
Well, you're right. You need to do a really good recruiting effort here, because the women have heard things aren't so good. They've heard some terrible stories. They've heard about husbands actually eating their wives. They've heard about, Indian raids. So you need to incentivize women to take the risks to come. Now, you can still get men because the economic incentives are high enough. So what the Virginia Company realizes that they need to do is they need to do something similar. They need to make them an offer they can't refuse, or at least some of them can't refuse. So they do a number of different things. They offer them free passage, which is basically a given. No one's going to, at this point, pay to come over, none of these women. But they also hit on a number of inequalities that are going on back home. So the women that they tend to recruit, they're very careful about it. First thing, they make sure that the women come over voluntarily. During the 17th century, you actually have a lot of kidnapping. So it's not that this wasn't a possibility. They could have kidnapped women for wives. England kidnaps lots of people for colonists, lots of people for servants. They specifically choose not to kidnap women to be the wives in early Jamestown. They want the women to come over voluntarily. They want them to be committed to the colonial endeavor. So they have to, therefore, incentivize them to come. They also want to make sure that these aren't the most desperate and destitute women. So they don't, take women with no other options. They need to set up incentives that are appealing to women who do have other options, but this is still better. So a number of different things happen. They provide a dowry, and this is going to be appealing to a lot of sort of lower middle-class women, working-class women who, plan on getting married, are working right now. They're working, in service as, domestic help, and probably are going to have to do that for about 10 years before they acquire enough money to set up their own household. A lot of people aren't that thrilled with this. And then if, they get enough money, then they'll marry someone about their same status in life, and that's fine. But what the Virginia Company is offering them is a way to set up their household earlier and also improve their position. So a lot of the women who decide to do this, like I said, they're women who had been domestic servants. They're able to leave service or not do service at all because the dowry is now provided for them. And they're offered the possibility of marriage to rich planters. So this is a type of social jump that they wouldn't be able to make in England. That they have the possibility of marrying rich men. They're promised high status in the colony. They're promised the first servants who come to the colony. They're also promised much more attractive treatment. The way the law is going to treat women with regard to how they can own property, the positions of power that they can have, and a more amorphous also sense of how they're going to be treated. When something is scarce, it's often given a higher value. And if you look at a lot of the colonial court cases dealing with women, you see that women, they're treated differently than they would have been back in England. They have a lot more power over their own marriage prospects. A lot of women become very, very wealthy. You're talking about how death and disease is terrible. Well, it depends. If, you're not that into your husband and he doesn't live that long and you manage to survive him and then you manage to take his money and then maybe do that again, within not that long a time, you can become quite wealthy and quite powerful in the new colony. And this is what happened to a lot of the women there.
Speaking of opportunities for women and the power they had when they arrived in Jamestown, were women allowed to choose their husbands when they arrived in the colony? And how long did the Virginia Company give them to choose a husband before it required them to marry?
Well, they didn't have to marry. I mean, the Virginia Company made it very clear that it's up to the women, that they have to come voluntarily, that they do have their choice of marriage partner, and, they can take the time that they need to get married. They're not going to be rushed into marriage. They'll provide them with food and shelter until they're ready to get married. The company feels fairly confident, though, that most of these women are going to want to marry and that they're going to do so fairly quickly. So the Virginia women are often referred to as tobacco wives. And there's a rumor in the, mail order bride circuit, if you will, about how, these women were bought because there was a payment that the men have to make to the Virginia Company to reimburse the Virginia Company for the women's passage. So they're required to pay 120 pounds of good leaf tobacco when they get married. And a lot of people see this as buying the women. But what you also notice if you look at the rules, the Virginia Company says that the women can marry whoever they want. If they marry a man who can afford to reimburse the passage, great, these men have to pay the company, but it's up to the women. And there's a line about how, if the women are so unwise as to, bestow their affections on poor guys, well, sucks for us, but we'll just have to deal with it and hope that he becomes rich later and maybe can reimburse us. But they make it very clear that the women have the right to choose whatever men they want, even if these men, can't reimburse the passage of the women over to the colony, and that it's up to the women to decide who they'll marry. Now, this wasn't really much of a risk. I think we're thinking a little bit about, modern day ideas about love and affection. But if you think about 17th century marriages, most of them really were about economics anyway. Most of the women who are going to be doing this are doing it to improve their marriage prospects, not for romance. So when the women come over, most of them are going to be thinking, what husband will provide the best life, has the best marriage prospects, economic prospects. And they tended to choose men who were going to be wealthy and would be able to reimburse the company for their passage. And that's what, most marriages were at this time. This wasn't something specific about mail order marriage. Most marriage was an economic partnership. The idea of marital love really had not come into play yet. Love was actually seen as an inconvenience in marriage and could hurt your bargaining power. If you actually love the person you were trying to marry, then you might not get such a good deal in the marriage.
So, was the Virginia Company correct? Did women choose to marry fairly quickly after they arrived in Jamestown? And did they really improve their economic status through marriage?
Most of them did marry quickly, and I would say yes with the caveat that Virginia was still not a great place, so a lot of the women died. For the ones who died, obviously it was a bad call. For the ones who survived, though, colonial women did quite well. Southern colonial women were often very wealthy, very powerful, so much so that you actually hear like the legislature in Maryland complaining about all these wealthy widows and, grumbling, oh, maybe we should make them get married because they have too much power and, influence and we don't like this, but there's nothing they can do at that time. So there's grumbling about the power of women, but you actually see them asserting it during this period with not much that the government really does to take it away. So there are a bunch of cases having to do with breach of promise to marry. And one of the things that's so interesting about them is these kinds of cases happen in England at the same time, but usually you see women bringing the cases because the person who brings the breach of promise to marry case is the one who thinks they've been hurt by the fact that the marriage has been called off. And in Virginia, you're seeing men bring it. So the men are upset because the woman has called off the marriage. It's the woman who is in the position of power, who's rejecting the man, and the man's been hurt by this. And, there's a big case that I write about in the book where all the facts are on the side of the man. He's awful, the Reverend Pooley. He's a horrible person. You don't blame Cicely at all for dumping him. Basically, she's a recent widow. He proposes to her while her husband's body is still warm. She says yes, but she also knows that this looks pretty bad. So she says, can we just, keep it on the down low, not tell anyone that, we're getting married at least for a little bit. He doesn't respect her wishes at all. Immediately starts broadcasting it all over the place that they're getting married. She's rightfully annoyed. She breaks up with him. He brings the breach of marriage suit. He should win because they had promised to marry in front of witnesses. All the proof is there. But this goes all the way back to England, goes up on appeal a number of times, and basically the government just refuses to rule against her. They don't want to tell women that they have to marry men that they don't want to. And later on, they certainly would, but during this period, they don't. After that case happens, the colonial legislature passes a law basically saying that you'll be in trouble if you do something like this again. It happens again. There's nothing they do. So during this period, for the women who, survive, they actually become quite powerful and better off than they would have been back in England.
Now, like Jamestown, New France also developed a mail-order bride system to bring women to its colony. Marcia, would you tell us about New France and why the colony found a mail-order marriage program necessary?
Well, it starts for a lot of the same reasons that you get one in Jamestown as well. You have a situation where you have a pretty big gender disparity. You have all of these French male colonists who come over. Very few French female colonists come over. And what starts to happen is that the men start marrying Indian women. And one of the differences between New France and Virginia is that originally the French colony encourages intermarriage. They actually think this is a good thing. They think that this will be a great way to both, assimilate and convert the local Indian population. They're so convinced in the superiority of French culture. It doesn't work out this way. What happens is all these French colonists go, you know what? I really like Indian culture. It's way better. There's an interesting exchange where early on in the colony's history, a group of Jesuit ministers are meeting with a group of Huron leaders to talk about intermarriage and how it's worked. And the Hurons are like, this is great. Your Frenchmen are making great Hurons. And the Jesuits are just appalled. They're like, no, this needs to end. So they pull out of backing intermarriage really early. And, you see it failing in a number of other ways as well. Originally, there was a dowry program set up to provide dowries for Indian women who had converted to Catholicism so that they could marry, the French colonists. And the dowry fund is never used. And basically, the Ursuline nuns who are in charge of it are saying, look, we've had hundreds of Indian women come through here, and not one of them has been assimilated. So the assimilation program's not working. And, the number of men who were leaving from Virginia was high. In New France, it was staggering. You've got a population of about 10,000 people, and, about 800 of them have left to, join the local Indian tribes. And again, this is a problem for purpose of colonization, which is to spread Western culture, Western religion, and show its superiority. When the people who are supposed to be doing this are leaving, it hurts your colonization efforts. So for all of these reasons, both for population growth and for, colonization in general, we have a problem. And the colony says, we need to do something. What the colony wants is for France to send a lot of new colonists in general, both men and women. And one of the differences with the French colonies and the English colonies is that France is a lot more reluctant to send people in general. England seems a lot more on board with getting rid of its population and sending them over to the colonies, but France needs their people more. So what they decide to do is they say, no, we're not going to send you a lot of people. We're going to send you a large group of marriageable women. They'll be high quality. We're going to increase your population through natural means. They'll have babies, and that's how we're going to grow New France. So similarities and differences in why it starts and how the program develops.
What were the backgrounds of French women who decided to migrate to New France? And when they arrived in the colony, did they have similar marriage choices as their Jamestown counterparts?
There are a lot of similarities. I'd say the French women, it worked out even better, I would say, for them. Part of it's the program's bigger. Jamestown has about 140 mail-order brides. The filles de roi, the French mail-order brides, there are about 800 of them. So this is a pretty big program. France is committed to this. And, again, the similarities, they give them dowries, they give them free passage, they give them the promise of their pick of men. The New France colony is nicer than Jamestown. People don't seem to be dying as badly there. Most of the women do survive, and their impact is staggering. There's a study that shows that about 3/4 of the genetic makeup of modern-day French Canada is a result of these 800 women. So the king was right. They came over and they had babies. And they had so many babies that, they are the founding mothers of New France. In terms of, what they get out of it, a lot of the women are the same kind of lower middle class, working class women who, see an opportunity, see a way to improve their situation. One of the things that is interesting about New France, which you don't see in Jamestown, is you actually get quite a few noble women. So the Jamestown women, a number of them, out of the 140, about 8 of them seem to have connections to sort of minor nobility. In New France, you actually have so many noble women signing up that the governor of New France starts getting annoyed because he says he doesn't have enough, captains and, generals and people for them to marry, that, they need to stop coming because we can't quite accommodate them all. But the idea that they thought that this was a good opportunity for them, is clear in the numbers that were trying to come. And, they're coming for the financial incentives. They're coming for the freedoms. So again, like in Virginia, but perhaps even more so, the laws in New France are very protective of the women. Treat them well and treat them well in a way that you don't see happening back in France. So some examples of that in terms of freedom from social structures, stereotypes, oppressive kind of ideas about women. So women can get remarried much quicker in New France. You can see from a lot of the marriage records that describe the women as pregnant when they get married. There's one, Fidera, who is really the only one, but she becomes a very famous prostitute, and she does that for many years. And then she decides to give it up and settle down and become a married woman, and that's fine. All's forgiven. So there's a very different treatment of women and the respect that's given to them. The other group of women that come over to New France a lot are religious women. So these women aren't coming over to marry, but they come over to New France because religious women are being treated so much better in the colony than back in France, where there's a big fight about power and the right of women to be powerful religious figures. You have the Counter-Reformation, women are being burned as witches. You're not getting any of that in New France. You're getting a very different treatment of women, respect for women, and that definitely plays out in how the Fidera are treated as well.
Did the better treatment of women in New France have to do with the fact that there just weren't as many women in New France?
Oh, yeah. I definitely think that has a lot to do with it. They have power, they can negotiate, and there's not that much that the men can say against it if they want to get married, right? So one of the things that's really interesting and also different than when compared with Jamestown is most of the Fidera sign marital contracts. So when you talk to people about mail order marriage, one of the things that people always seem concerned about are, you're marrying someone that you don't know. Maybe you're going to be exploited, taken advantage of. All of these concerns are legitimate concerns. But in New France, 90-some-odd% of them sign these premarital contracts specifically to lessen the risks of marrying a stranger. And the contracts do a number of different things. I mentioned that the women are all given a dowry before they get married. And one of the things the contracts will do is it makes sure that if the couple separates, the women get to keep their dowry money, which would not necessarily happen without these contracts. And some of them are even more favorable than that. They say not only would they keep their dowry, but they'd have a certain percentage of the property as well. Things that you just tend not to see in marital contracts in France. It's not that you couldn't see them, but women back in France just don't have the bargaining power to get those concessions from the husbands. In New France, there are more men than women, and the women have other options. If you're not going to sign the contract showing that, you promise in the case of separation to treat her fairly, she's going to move on. And, she has the time to negotiate. She's not forced into a marriage. She's allowed to wait as long as she needs. A lot of the women really date for a while. And again, this is different than what you would see back in France, where most of them actually, they may know the man that they're going to marry, but there's not much courting going on during this period. In New France, they actually have the time and ability to meet these men and change their minds. One of the things you'll see if you look at this history is that a lot of the women enter into multiple contracts with multiple men. So you see, one of them thinks, oh, this guy looks good, and she starts dating him. They sign a contract, but then something happens, and she breaks off the contract with him, and she signs it with another man. Wait, maybe not him. Goes back to the first. So she has the time to decide whether or not this is a good deal for her, is in her interest, and this is someone that she actually wants to marry. And it probably puts her in a much better position than she would have if she was marrying back home.
The mail-order marriage system proved to be so successful in New France that the French tried to develop a similar system for colonial Louisiana. Marcia, would you tell us about colonial Louisiana and about its mail-order marriage program?
I've been telling you about two success stories, and Louisiana is definitely not one, and it's their fault. It starts out very similar. Again, you have a situation where men outnumber women. The men, they're not staying long. A lot of them are dying too. Louisiana is definitely not as healthy as New France. Some of them are leaving to intermarry with native women. So the colony is very small. One of the big differences as well, and the thing that's freaking France out, is that by this point, the American colonies are thriving and they're expanding and they're pushing at the borders. They don't actually know how small Louisiana is, but if they actually get into an armed confrontation with them, there's going to be problems. And Louisiana knows this, and they know they need, a rapid increase in population. So all of these things are making them very nervous. And, they want to try the mail order bride program, but they do it differently. So, they do a similar type of recruitment. They offer women lots of incentives to come over, dowries, free passages, promise to, marry the men of their choosing. What they leave out is how terrible it is in Louisiana. The women don't realize. And when they do the recruiting effort, they actually make Louisiana sound like a utopia. There's a lot of talk of like bread and honey and how everything's wonderful and you'll come over here and you'll just be a queen. And the women back in France are actually competing for a slot. They think it's so desirable. So, the first group, they get over to Louisiana right as the starving times are beginning. And the women are appalled. They've been lied to. They're enraged. They immediately try to get back on the boats and go back to France. The captains actually bar their way. The women are prisoners. They've been lied to and they can't leave. And they rebel to an extent. There's something that's often called the Petticoat Rebellion. And if you read the history around it, you can see that their concerns are just not taken seriously. They have every reason to be enraged. They've been treated horribly. But in the letters from the government that actually talk about the Petticoat Rebellion, they talk about how the women are displeased with the food because it's not as tasty as the food that they're used to in Paris. So they're just being difficult, but we've been able to subdue their concerns by teaching them how to spice foods according to the Indian style, and now they're okay with everything. So they really downplay their role in the women's anger and take no responsibility for it. But that doesn't mean that word doesn't get back to France. So even though the women don't get back to France, word does get back to France about how terribly the first set of mail-order brides have been treated. And now Louisiana has a problem because no other women want to sign up for Louisiana's mail-order bride program. And Louisiana is still majorly struggling with population, desperate for more women. They managed to get like another 12 mail-order bride recruits, but these are desperate women. These are poor, destitute, starving, sick women. And what's shocking is that though these are the only women they managed to get, they still don't appreciate them at all. You read the account of the women's voyage over to New France. They're treated terribly. They're made fun of. They're called ugly. And, there's a lot of talk about, about their looks. There's a lot of talk about their virtue. It looks like the captain may have raped one of them, but they blame it all on the women. And then they get to Louisiana and basically no one wants to marry them because, according to the accounts, they're just not pretty enough. So a couple of them marry, the rest are left, destitute, living in misery, and pretty much die off quickly. And that's the end of the voluntary mail-order bride program in Louisiana. Then they turn to forced immigration.
What exactly did forced immigration mean? I mean, did the French government really force women to migrate to Louisiana and to marry its men?
Yeah, so that second group of mail-order brides, all the accounts about why that failed was because they're too ugly. They say, had they been pretty enough, it wouldn't have mattered. Nothing else would have mattered. And they're basically paving the way to allow the forced immigration of female prisoners. The previous programs we've been talking about, Jamestown and New France, they cared very much about the virtue of the women. They cared very much about the voluntariness of it. The women had to have letters of recommendation from their priests at home saying that, they're of good moral character and all of that. In Louisiana, they ditch all of that. They decide that the Louisiana men just care if they have a nice face and a good figure, and everything else doesn't matter. So they start conscripting women from the Paris penitentiaries. And for all the reasons that the previous programs didn't do this, all those problems happen now in Louisiana. The women who come from the penitentiaries are not willing. They're not committed to the colonial endeavor. The ones who do make it over, they do one of two things. They either turn around and get right back on the boat as soon as they can, or they're like, oh, okay, well, now I'm in Louisiana, but I'm still going to be a prostitute, a thief. I'm not going to settle down and be a nice housewife. So there are a lot of accounts about how these women were just running rampant and ruining the colony, and this was the worst idea that anyone ever had. The real tragedy about it is that very few of the women actually even made it. Thousands of women were recruited to do this or forced to do this, and most of them died en route. These are women who are already pretty sick, and this was the last straw. So, thousands of women, and then you have a few hundred who actually managed to come over. So they're not saving Louisiana. They're causing more problems for Louisiana. And basically, the Louisiana mail-order bride program is a failure.
After the 17th century gave way to the 18th century, and the French and English colonies began to grow, mail-order marriage programs in North America waned until about the 1850s. Marcia, did the practice of mail-order marriage in North America really end altogether between the 17th and mid-19th centuries?
Not entirely, but primarily. So, the colonial period is done. You no longer have this major gender disparity. You still have westward expansion. It's steady, but it's slow. We're talking, a mile a year kind of thing. So you don't have, men rushing forward and leaving the women behind. They're bringing their families with them. So you don't have this population disparity from the colonial period. It doesn't mean there are no mail-order marriages. So during the 18th century is when you get the first American marital advertisements. And the first ones actually were joke advertisements written by Benjamin Franklin. He was taking them clearly from a form he was familiar with from English matrimonial advertisements, from English papers, but mocking them. So in America, during this period, no one saw a need to advertise for a wife. In fact, marriage was pretty much universal. Anyone who wanted to get married could get married, and people who didn't get married were punished. There were all these towns where you couldn't be single, where you couldn't be a bachelor, you couldn't live places, you couldn't leave your parents' home. You had to get married, and they could require you to get married because it wasn't hard. Most people grew up and, stayed where they were born or only moved slightly further away. They, knew the people, they knew, who their marriage prospects were, and if they needed help, their parents could probably help them find someone as well. So given that situation, advertising for a bride seemed very weird and very suspicious, and there was a lot of mockery of the sort of people who'd even consider it, that they were all cheats and frauds, and you should never respond to any of these because the only people who would do this were people who were out to steal your money. And that's basically what Franklin's advertisements were all about. They're making fun of the sort of people who advertise for spouses. His first published in 1722. It looks like the first legitimate American matrimonial advertisement was in 1759. But, starting at that period, they're constant but small numbers. It's really not until we get back to the gold rush that we see mail-order marriage take off again.
Yes, the gold rush. Would you tell us about this event and how it sparked a new interest, or rush, if you will, in mail-order marriages?
You have a similar pattern happening again. So until the gold rush, westward expansion, like I said, like a mile a year, people push the frontier just a little bit. They bring their families. They're not far from, their previous towns. But with the gold rush, you get this huge group of single men flocking out to California well before the women come out there. So once again, you have a situation where you have a whole bunch of single men and very few white women, marriageable women. And some of the problems are similar, some of the problems are different. We don't have the same level of colonial concerns in the sense of, manifest destiny is all accepted at this point in terms of, America thinks it's going to make its way to the Pacific Ocean. They thought they would go a little slower, but, this is where we're headed anyway. California is going to be American. That kind of fear isn't quite there with California, but there are a lot of concerns about the violence that's going on in California. This isn't really how they wanted to settle the West. What had been happening before California was a very orderly, family-oriented expansion. People move west with their families. They set up new towns. They set up government slowly. And then instead, what's going on with California is that all of these men rush over. A lot of them are very, very lawless. A lot of them are very, very violent. And this is worrisome for a lot of people. And the solution that a lot of people hit on is that we need women. This is the beginning of basically of the Victorian period, right? And the idea of women as a civilizing influence, hearth and home. In order to make these men safe, we need to marry them. But in order to marry them, we need white women out there so that they can marry them. So, that's all well and good, but again, you need to incentivize the women to come. So why do the women come? Some of the same reasons, but some of them change a little bit. Things for women in 1849, 1850 are not great, especially the sort of women that we're talking about here, sort of working class women. A lot of the women have been working in factories. The factories are laying people off, reducing their hours. Women are the first to go. So women who had been kind of used to having an income, economic prospects, are seeing a lot of those doors closing. A lot of them are seeing domestic service as the only option for them. So they're looking at these prospects, which are not particularly appealing. And they're also watching all of these men go west to make their fortunes. And a lot of the women are like, hey, that seems like an opportunity. I'd like to go west as well. And you start getting mail-order bride recruitment missions going on. And for a lot of women, it's attractive. It seems like a good idea and a way for them to take part in, this amazing economic opportunity that so many men are flocking to.
So here's a logistical question for you. I assume that all the mail-order brides in the 17th century came from Europe via transatlantic ships. So How did all the mail-order brides destined for California make their way from the East Coast to the West Coast in the days before the Transcontinental Railway?
A lot of them went by boat as well. And this was a bit of a problem, too, because that boat ride was really, really expensive. California was the first place where you start seeing Miller marriage prospects pop up again. But they don't really get successful until slightly later when things get cheaper, when we do have the Transcontinental Railroad. So there are women who are interested, but they can't afford it. So a lot of it turns on whether or not they'll have their passage paid. So the first recruitment effort was sponsored by this woman, Eliza Farnham, and she had just inherited a whole bunch of land out in California, and she's worried because she's been hearing these horrible stories about all the violence that's going on in California. She's a recent widow. She has 2 young sons. She wants to go out to California and claim her land, but she's also nervous about, what kind of place will this be? Is this someplace that, she wants to raise her kids? What are the prospects for California? And, she believes very strongly in the civilizing influence of women. She's a leader in the domestic feminism movement, which is all about, they believe in the superiority of women, but they believe in the superiority of women through their womanly, domestic type of traits. So she decides that she's going to recruit all of these women to help marry the miners and civilize them and calm them down and, make California a habitable place to be. The problem for Farnham is that she doesn't pay for the women to go, so she wants to recruit a lot of women like her, upper-class women. And her pitch is basically, do this for your country. Sacrifice your Eastern comforts, your warm fires and all of that to go out west and toil with the miners and, help manifest destiny, settle this country, all that kind of thing. The problem is most of those women had no interest in doing this. They liked their nice Eastern warm fires and had, little desire to go live in some sort of, mining town and dangerous gold rush place. So those women aren't interested. They don't sign up. The women who are interested are the ones I was mentioning before, the women who have been working in the factories, who don't see much in the way of future prospects, want to go somewhere where they think women are going to be a lot more respected, will be able to, earn a decent wage, treated better. But these women don't have any money, and they're not who Farnham wants. She's, not particularly interested in them. When they sign up, she doesn't work hard to get them the funds. In the end, her mail-order bride program is a disaster. I think she brings over like 4 people. Maybe it's only 3. One of them leaves to marry the ship's captain on the way over to California. So, it's not particularly successful, but the idea is she had a lot of support for her idea. All of the papers go on and on about how wonderful this idea is. And, this is the forerunner of a whole bunch of mail-order bride expeditions that do happen in the West. And it also spurs California to really start recruiting women. And they do that in a number of different ways. So they realize, they may need, to recruit women to come on their own. So how are they going to really incentivize women to come? One of the things that they do is they make California's laws really, really female friendly, particularly in terms of property ownership. During this period, married women have no right to their property, but in California, they are going to have a right to their property. And one of the things this means is that if you answer an ad, you marry a rich miner, and, he promises you certain things, you can make sure that that property will stay your property even if the marriage doesn't last. And that's the other thing that California offers. Very, very liberal divorce laws. So a lot of the women who come out, it's not that big a risk because if the man they just married doesn't work out, they can leave. And there's always someone, waiting in the wings to step in and take his place as well.
Throughout our conversation, we've been talking about how early North American mail-order marriage systems recruited women. And in all the cases we studied here, recruiters go back to places where there are women and try to convince women that they should move to places where there are few women. Was this the only system of recruitment that worked? I mean, were there other ways that men and women made their desire for a mail-order spouse known to each other?
Well, it starts, the colonial period, you basically have the government posting broadsides. And then you have, slightly later, the recruiters with their, full-page ads in the newspapers. But by the later 19th century, what's really taken over is individuals. Newspapers are all over the place. You've got newspapers that only exist as matrimonial advertisements. There are dozens of these matrimonial newspapers. And, it was the precursor to Tinder and all of that. It was lonely people who were having problems meeting people where they were and wanted to increase their marital prospects. So they would place ads in these papers, far away. So, a miner in California would place an ad in, a New York paper, and he would write about himself or what he was looking for in a woman. And then, women would read it and they'd start corresponding. And by this point, you have the Transcontinental Railroad. It's not as hard to go out there, so that people would correspond for a bit. And if, it seemed like a good idea, if they seemed interested in meeting, then usually he'd send her a ticket and she'd come out. And the papers during this period are also full of all of these stories, both good and bad, of these Miller marriage meetings. So, the woman gets off of the train and he's there waiting for her and, it's love at first sight, or she takes one look at him and decides, nope, I'm getting right back on that train.
In your book, Buying a Bride, and through our conversation, it really seems like early American mail-order marriage programs were good programs. Well, with the exception of Louisiana and its forced migration program. But on the whole, mail-order marriage programs seem to have offered participants opportunities and choices. Now, aside from Louisiana, were there any other downsides for participants in early American mail-order marriage programs?
Mail-order marriage has always been risky. Women make the decision that the potential benefits outweigh the risks. Really what I'm arguing is that this was a rational choice, that these women understood the risks, that in many cases it worked out, but not in all cases. And there were certain things that happened over time to reduce risks, but there was always the possibility of fraud. There are a number of cases, from the 19th century where women are lured to enter into marriages with men who are already married, so they're not actually able to get married, and then the men leave them, so they're deflowered and they're ruined in that way. There was always the possibility of, violence as well. There are a few cases about that too. People using matrimonial advertising to meet victims. These sorts of things could happen. Miller marriage has always been a risk, but on balance, most of the time, Miller marriage did benefit the people who entered into it. It's a way for people who may not have that many marriage prospects or economic prospects, mobility prospects, to change their lives. And for women in particular, the men are the colonists, the men are the miners. They're the ones who are able to move and, go out and seek their fortune. And the women aren't able to do this in the same way. Marital immigration gave them that mobility. It gave them that power to change their lives that they didn't have in their place of origin. And for a lot of the women, it was a very, very feminist move. A lot of the women come from places where women were being actively devalued. During the second half of the 19th century, Miller marriage was recommended in response to certain campaigns about surplus women, and that's the term that they use. All of these women who were unmarriageable and therefore just a drain on society and a waste. And, if woman's only purpose was to be married, if you live in a place like that treats you as worthless, Miller marriage was a very good option for leaving the place where you're devalued and going to the place that wants you so much that they're paying for you to come. They're changing their laws so you can come. A lot of times in the later 19th century, what you see happening is the states that are recruiting women, they give them the right to vote.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if mail-order marriage programs had not developed in North America? How would this settlement and European colonization of North America been different?
That is such an interesting question. I think the biggest difference would have to do with intermarriage with Native women. A lot of what Miller brides did, and the big reason that they were recruited, was to prevent the colonists from intermarrying. So if we're going to assume that getting rid of Miller brides would have increased intermarriage, the question is, what would that have done? One of the things that's different about the United States from a lot of other countries in the Western Hemisphere is that we did have so much less intermarriage with the Native population. What that would have done is hard to say. It might have simply made, a more complicated racial class system. So you would have, a mestizo class that was less than white, but higher ranked than African Americans and full American Indians. It's also possible that it actually would have changed, white Indian relations. that, maybe, just speculating, maybe some of the worst atrocities wouldn't have happened. Maybe land would have been taken less through battles and, fraud and more through intermarriage, and maybe this would have been better. It's hard to say exactly, but I think that's where the change would have been. How would it affect modern American Indians if we'd still have the reservation system, if we would have still had, all of the awful Trail of Tears and the allotment system and termination? It's very hard to know, but I do think that if there had been more intermarriage, there might have been a hope that some of those things wouldn't have happened.
Marcia, what aspect of history are you researching now?
Well, I have two possibilities. One has to do with bride smuggling, looking at the history of it. I do immigration law, I do family law, and immigration law often keeps people out, but people are often creative in trying to get people in. So mail order marriage is a way to legally bring people into this country. But what happens when you can't bring your spouse in? What are the laws that prevent that? What are the ways people have gone around it? Is that marital fraud? And how has it changed the people you're trying to keep out and the ways people have creatively brought their family members in? The other project has to do with marrying for things, basically gold digging, but not simply about money, but all the different ways that people have married to improve their situation and how the law actually encourages people to do that.
And where should we look to find more information about you and how we can contact you if we still have questions about early American mail-order marriage programs?
Well, you can always contact me by email. My email is zug, Z-U-G, @law.sc.edu, and most of my articles are on SSRN, the Social Science Network.
Marcia Zug, thank you for taking us through the early American world of mail-order marriage.
Thank you very much for having me. It was fun.
How do you build and establish colonies without women? The answer is, you can't. Women were integral to the establishment and building of European colonies in North America. Without women, colonies teetered on failure. Because few men wanted to stay in North America without women. They wanted companionship, families, and someone to do all the domestic work that women did back in Europe. Plus, governments wanted and needed women in their colonies. They recognized the civilizing or calming power that women had on men. Plus, when men and women live together, they tend to procreate. And having lots of French and English babies sustained colonies, promoted their growth, and spread the reach of European culture. Also, how about the Filles de Roi, those mail-order brides of New France? They were truly the founding mothers of French Canada. Now, as Marcia pointed out, it wasn't enough to simply bring women over to the colonies. When forced to migrate, as they were in colonial Louisiana, colonial maintenance and growth programs by mail-order marriage failed. Women had to want to migrate to make these programs work. And if you wanted to encourage women to migrate, you needed to offer them better opportunities, which, from the 17th through 19th centuries, included increased legal rights and protections. Look for more information about Marcia, her book, Buying a Bride, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/120. If you're interested in discovering more about early American sailors and how they shaped the early United States' foreign relations, don't forget to check out Brian Rouleau's With Sails Whitening Every Sea. You can discover more about this book by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/Cornell. And if you like what you read, be sure to use your special promo code 09BFW because it will save you 30% off this title and more from Cornell University Press. Finally, what do you think about the early American mail-order bride programs we just learned about? Do you think you would have attempted to participate in one of these programs had you lived in the early modern period? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. In our third season of Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore some of the biggest issues dividing these global powers today. Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, China's growing military might, and also robots. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.